Hey, hey! Looks like we are live. Looks like we don't have any technical issues this time. Thanks for joining me this evening. Looks like we got a few people hanging out already. And between when I started talking and now is the delay in the stream. So expect about a 30-second delay on everything. Um, let's see, got a couple people watching now. I think one of those might be me. So yeah, go ahead, say hi. And tonight we're going to try and keep things a little bit more focused and just talk double reeds. That's going to be bassoons, oboes, sarussophones if you want to talk them, crumhorns, shawms, dulcians. So everything double reed related as it relates to the wind band. So that's going to be tonight's topic. And in particular, I want to talk a little bit about expanding the double reed section. Tunarth, hi, how are you? So, yeah, we're going to be talking double reeds all night. So, to be a little bit more focused, hello. See, we're being fancy proper, Miss Emily. How are you? No alto clarinet tonight, Emily. All double reeds all the time. So, uh, so go ahead and start getting some questions ready, and I will do my best to answer them. And again, remember, everything's going to be on about a 30-second delay. I'm filming right in front of me on my iPhone, and then I'll be watching the comments on my laptop over here. So, yeah, and we'll wait till maybe a couple more people show up. Looks like we got only about 2 or 3 in here now. But one of the things I thought we'd, start off with is, so let's talk double reeds. Okay, here's a good question. Are the lower notes of the oboe d'amore and the cor anglais able to be played quietly? I've heard that they are, but I want to be for sure. Good question. They can be, yes. They are more stable than the lower notes of the oboe. And part of that has some to do with the bore design of the larger instruments. Because those instruments are designed to play down into their bottom register, they will have a slightly more compact bore taper, whereas the oboe will be a little bit wider. And the players are going to be making reeds that are going to be much more suited to playing those bottom notes. Now there are good oboe players out there who can play those really low notes, pianissimo. One of the things that came up when I was doing the Zephyros Wind Ensemble concert is one of the commissions we had, or not commissions, but competition winners, had a lot of low B naturals in the oboe that were really soft. And the first, we went through 2 second oboe players. One was just there to kind of fill in, and then we got our permanent player. But the person who came in and played it the first time was an accomplished second oboe player who really was able to play those low B naturals pianissimo, contrary to what a lot of orchestration texts will tell you, that she was able to do that. Now, the second oboe player who came in could not handle those as confidently. She could play the note, but it didn't have that velvety, rich sound. There's a second oboe note in the Moldau that's infamous for being hard to play softly. You know what? The Czech composers are notorious for that. Dvorak in particular, second oboe players hate Dvorak. The Dvorak violin concerto is terrible for the second oboe player. On top of all that, Dvorak puts all the English horn solos in first oboe. So the second oboe player doesn't even get the glorious part of playing the English horn. So there's that. All right, got my espresso going. Brewed it so strong that I can chew it. depends on a lot how the low register is approached and how accomplished the player is. Yeah, and that's absolutely true on that. And sometimes the Dvorak uses an auxiliary instrument for just a few bars. Um, I'm trying to think where that's the case, and it may only be the case with the bass clarinet that he will use in his very last few tone poems. I'm thinking like the Noonday Witch, maybe one of them, the Spinning Wheel. There are a handful of those really late Dvorak pieces that will use bass clarinet. Piccolo, yeah, he uses piccolo a lot more than he uses any of the other auxiliary instruments. I don't think Dvorak ever uses contrabassoon. He uses basset horn in one piece, and he uses contrabass clarinet in one piece. But he never, as far as I know, uses contrabassoon, which is a bit odd. All right, so it looks like we've got a handful more people in here. So something that is interesting with the double reed. Hi, Thomas. How are you? Is that there's a big disparity between their role and in the orchestra and the wind band. In the orchestra, the double reeds make up half of the woodwind section, whereas in the wind band, they make up a very small portion of the wind band. So we have a very big discrepancy between their roles in the two ensembles. Basset horn and contrabass clarinet. Wow, I want to know what pieces they are. Emily, the contrabass clarinet is used in the prelude of his final opera, Kate and the Devil. I think it's the prelude. It may be somewhere later on in the piece. That score I have literally seen once in my life. It is not on IMSLP. There is a basset horn part in the Czech suite, I think it is. It says either basset horn or English horn. I think it's the Czech suite, but don't quote me on that. So anyway, back to what I was saying about the double reeds. In a typical orchestra, let's say we have an orchestra with woodwinds in 3. So that's a total of 12 woodwinds. Of those 12, 6 are double reeds, and then 3 are flutes and 3 are clarinets. Well, a similar setup in the wind band. So if we go our woodwinds in 3s, we've got 3 flutes, and we'll say we have our 3 oboes, so it's 2 oboes, English horn, 2 bassoons, contrabassoon. Well, we're going to have our 4 saxes, and then we're going to have a bunch of clarinets, maybe 12 clarinets. And at that point, the clarinets are, the double reeds, I should say, are vastly outnumbered, and so they will get lost. What do I think about the octavin? The octavin is a very weird instrument that was literally only made for about 1 year. Now, I think it's like 1898. Adler made the octavin for 1 year, maybe 2 years into 1899, and that's it. And it was never used. They're museum instruments at this point. I remember playing Dvorak 8, and the English horn only plays 3 bars in the first movement, and it's in the first oboe part. Yeah, Dvorak 8 is the piece of Dvorak's I've played the most. I've played it twice, and there's a little bit of English horn in it. Yeah, it's not scoring that I would suggest following a lot. So anyway, back to the double reed discrepancy within the wind ensemble. Because the numbers are so much fewer, they are considered color instruments, whereas in the orchestra, they are very much core instruments. And because in the United States, we generally use the wind band as our educational medium, as well as the case in a lot of other countries, this leads to a dearth of double reed players. But what would happen in the wind band if we started to expand the role of these double reed parts and really start bumping their numbers up. And I'm not the first person to suggest this. Going all the way back to Percy Granger, who really said, yeah, we need to bolster our double read numbers. And in fact, even Granger isn't the first person to suggest this. We go all the way back to the earliest thing that we can really call a much more modern wind band, and we look at something like Handel's music for the Royal Fireworks. 24 oboes, 12 bassoons. No other woodwinds. It's just all oboes and bassoons, and it's a fantastic sound. It's lacking in the tone color that we expect today. But I don't suggest that we go that extreme. But what are people's thoughts about it? About starting to expand the numbers and roles of the double reeds within the wind band. So I've got, sorry for being redundant about the octavin, but it's an instrument I'm very interested in. Would it be possible to have a clarinet builder use schematics and build an octavin that would work? They would have to have an instrument to copy, basically. I can't really comment much on the octavin. I don't believe I've ever seen one in person. I've heard a few recordings of them. They are really just, they were a historical anomaly. It's just not something that's going to pop up very often. It'd be nice to have more double reeds in the wind band, wind ensemble, but there don't seem to be as many good players around. Well, this is that catch-22 situation, Emily. There aren't good players around because, well, we don't train enough of them because there's not enough parts to fill within the band. So if we increase the number of parts that we need, then we increase the number of players that we have to train. Now, the caveat on this is that double reeds are also the most expensive instruments in the wind band. We can go and get a cheap B-flat clarinet that will work pretty well. I mean, even the top-end Buffet R13, we can get a decent used instrument for a couple $1,000. You spend a couple $1,000 on an oboe, and you're still looking at a lamp. Similar situation with alto clarinet to some degree. Alto clarinet is a very different situation. It's alto clarinet is probably one of the most complicated situations in its non-use that we have. It's so many different contributing factors there. Double reed players also often make their own reeds. True, but that shouldn't be a limiting factor. In fact, I've moved over to playing the Leger reeds, and they're perfectly fine. Is there any reason double reeds are more expensive than others besides supply and demand? A lot of reasons, Theo. Double reeds take a lot more time to make. The process of making a single reed is fairly straightforward. A double reed is a lot more work. In fact, if you really charge the equivalent price, your double reeds would probably cost about twice as much as they do now compared to what single reeds cost. So, double reeds are expensive to make. They take time. Typically, when I was making bassoon reeds, I would spend about 2 weeks from start to finish on one reed. Unfortunately, educational band music has become so codified, I should say, at the major publishers in the U.S., as far as forces allowed to be used, that any significant change will come from outside that system. Absolutely correct. The music publishers have basically codified, like you're saying, what we use, what we can use, and it's an interesting situation there. A publisher would not look at most of my music because it's not stuff that they would be able to sell easily because it's so outside of the box. All right. they have to learn. So they have to learn reed making. Yeah, but so what? I think learning reed making, that's part of the job. Perfect summary of the alto clarinet. Yeah, I watch the video I did with Matt Banks, the lecture we gave on Who's Afraid of the Alto Clarinet, if you really want the full summary there. Sorry, I meant the instruments themselves, not just the reeds. Okay. So some of it is supply and demand. That said, it, oboes and bassoons are much more difficult to make than the other wind instruments. I read an article years and years ago, excuse me, about a flute maker who handmade flutes, and was talking about the process of making those. And he'd make and sell a flute. This was back in like the 60s. He could make and sell a flute. I think it was like $1,000. And then he said, I'm going to do the same thing and make a bassoon. And after all was said and done, he said the same amount of work that went into making a flute that you could sell for $1,000 to make a profit, you would sell that bassoon for $15,000 because it's so much more complicated. The wood turning alone on a bassoon is one of the most difficult aspects of instrument manufacture there is. The dual bores on the boot joint. On oboes, the key work is the most difficult key work system on any of the standard woodwind instruments. Excepting, of course, things like paperclip, or all the contrabass clarinets, really, particularly the paperclips and the Selmer Rosewoods. We can make saxophones for probably about the same cost as saxes. I would, from a production point of view, probably so, because there's not a lot different mechanically between the two. But you would fall into supply and demand there. So oboes and bassoons do tend to be much more difficult to make. The interior design of the bore, particularly if you're reaming that out of wood, is a difficult process, and you have to have exact reamers to the shape of the inside, and sometimes you have to have multiples of those. And if you're working with wood, you're subject to a lot of different changes. So, great question so far, guys. Sounds like we got a lot of gears turning there. So, on that front, in wind band, we typically only will have. Okay, let me answer this. What's the latest news on the subcontra bassoon? I didn't talk to Richard today, but I know he's been traveling, and actually he was in Toronto yesterday or the day before, Emily. So he's up in your neck of the woods, or was. He was at the Fox factory today, and he picked up a bunch of parts for the subcontra bassoon. So that is, so he has those in hand now, and I believe they're driving back now to Arkansas. Cylinders are easier to make than cones. Absolutely correct. Yeah, this is why a clarinet is much easier to make than an oboe. Does the reed contrabass deserve a revival? I'm going to say no on that. The reed contrabass, as originally designed, was not a great instrument. Its fingering system did not follow that of any of the other woodwinds. Its fingering system is essentially that of the ophicleide. I say that as I'm sitting here staring at my ophicleide across the room, and it is the most ungodly and stupid fingering system ever imagined by human beings. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. The reed contrabass fell into that same line. The only reason I could see using the reed contrabass would be for horror effects in like a big Hollywood monster movie, where that thing would just rip through the ensemble because it is so large. But don't expect it to be well played or in tune. So there's that. All right, so back to what I was saying a moment ago. Blah, blah, blah. In the wind band, we typically only have oboes, bassoons. Occasionally, in more advanced pieces, we get English horns. And this is something I was talking about with a friend of mine who's going to be doing the, or at least part of the premiere of Symphony 4. It looks like it's getting moved back until the spring, but I'll talk about that later. And I tend to agree with him that contrabassoons have moved in the past 20 years from a real specialty thing that you really didn't see 20 years ago in a lot of wind bands to within college level becoming pretty much required, and we're even seeing them now in high schools. So the contrabassoons are starting to really say, yeah, we're here. We're getting used a lot. So we've got the four double reeds. Beyond that, within the wind band, there are a few handfuls of pieces that use instruments outside of that. The only one of really significant note is Granger's Children's March. And I hope everybody in the room knows the Children's March. It is, for my money, it is the absolute best original march written for the wind band. I mean, I would argue that march above any others. That includes Sousa, Cale King, Kenneth Alfred, all the big march guys. Give me Granger's Children's March. But that piece has a very important bass oboe part in it, and it actually opens up with the bass oboe. I mean, but it's most often played on a English horn because he doesn't take the part down very low. There's a few low D's and low C's in it that would be outside of the range of the English horn. But otherwise, you don't see any of the other double reeds in wind band music often. I'm scoring for Oboe d'Amore in the piece I'm writing. Thomas, what kind of ensemble is it for? Oboe d'Amore is a tricky one. You might be able to score for it fairly confidently at a university that has a graduate program. If they don't have a graduate program, I wouldn't. I know someone. I know someone who knows someone. Okay, yeah. That. So yeah, that works. Yeah, Children's March is a great piece. Common Pikachu. I've always wondered if you could invent a new instrument for the wind band, what would it be like? Okay, so I have talked about this a little bit before. There are a few there are a few gaps within the instrumental ranges that I think really should be filled in. And since we're talking about the double reeds, let's go ahead and go down that rabbit hole, because I like going down that rabbit hole. And we're going to just, for that question, I'm just going to focus on the oboes and the bassoons. So with the oboes, we have a few holes missing in the family. As I watch this, I really move my hands a lot. I really should stop drinking straight espresso at 8 o'clock at night. I'm not sleeping. Anyway, so holes within the oboe family. I think the biggest one that I think most people will notice is that the oboe family does not descend down into the bass register. Elsewhere on my channel, you will find a couple videos where I digitally manipulated a bass oboe down both a fifth and an octave that would create what would be essentially a bass English horn in F and then a contrabass oboe in C. And those produce really interesting and rich results. And there has been talk about oboe instruments in that range for a couple hundred years. We know that there was a contrabass oboe in use in excuse me, one of the Paris orchestras, I believe, in the late 1700s, where that instrument may still exist. I may have seen some photos of it, and that may have been an F instrument, so a bass English horn. Um, and it would have been used for basso continuo parts or to play along with the bassoons. Richard Strauss talked about hearing one. We do not know exactly what instrument he heard in around 1900. It was at the Belgian Conservatory. The orchestration teacher, Javert, was there and demonstrated to Strauss a bunch of different instruments, including what Strauss claimed was a contrabass oboe, full octave lower than the bass oboe or the Heckelphone. They also at that time had a big clarinet choir that would have had a contrabassett horn in F as well as a contrabass clarinet in B flat. So very early uses of those. But yeah, so those would be some great instruments to add in. I had a friend today I know make a comment. He would love to see an oboe in B flat, a band oboe, basically, kind of like a B flat clarinet, but an oboe pitched as a whole step lower. It would make for an interesting new tone color. Such instruments have existed. There is some evidence that Haydn scored for oboes in B flat in, I cannot remember off the top of my head. I'd have to go back through some of my research materials, but he the and the score was called an oboe luongo, basically of the long oboe, and such an instrument wouldn't be too much more difficult to make than a regular oboe. It would be kind of interesting. A bonobo, if you will. Now that's a type of chimpanzee. To riff on banning oboes, yeah, or compare them to what are essentially fiendish sex monkeys. I can say that. I worked at the zoo. I worked around chimpanzees a lot. Anyway, on the upper end, yeah, I was just about to get there. The piccolo oboe musette, or as I tend to call it, a sopranino oboe, because it's not really a piccolo. Piccolo would mean it's a full octave higher. So, in a couple weeks, I am going to be hosting a friend of mine. Mikey Sluman is coming to town, and he's going to be staying with me for a few days, and he's going to have a piccolo oboe with him, as well as his bass oboe. In fact, he might be bringing the whole family. I don't know if he's bringing his d'amore or not. Yes. Okay. So, Emily, yes. He is born. Il est né. The Christmas. The Christmas Carol. When they talk about musettes in there, it is a type of bagpipe, and it's this is why I don't like using the term musette for the smaller oboe, because the real musette is a type of bagpipe, and so in order to differentiate between the two, piccolo oboe or sopranino oboe is preferred. That's Loray's term for it, not mine. Yeah, Loray calls it the piccolo oboe. The more and more I hear, people don't really like the Loray instruments. They tend to go more for the patricolas, the patricolas being in E flat. So yeah, you could say Mirago calls it an oboe musette. Yeah, and so does Patricola. But I don't like the term musette for there because it does have a lot of confusion there. Oh, let's see. Thoughts on the Sarrusophone. I've got lots of thoughts on the Sarrusophone. I've probably written more extensively on the Sarrusophone um, than pretty much any composer. Yeah, Sopranino fits it a lot better, and it's an accurate description. So, Sarrusophones are an interesting might have been at this point. I spent most of my undergrad, I did play quite a bit of Sarrusophone. Um, our university, University of Texas at Arlington, had a Sarrusophone. We did not, however, have a contrabassoon. So this gets back to what I was saying earlier, that contrabassoon is really starting to take off and becoming a lot more common. Well, my undergrad university didn't have a contrabassoon. It wouldn't have it for several years until after I graduated. So I may not have gotten it till like 2010 or so. But am I from DFW? Yeah, I am. Um, with the Sarrusophones, um, they are an interesting and distinct tone color. Um, I I've spent quite a bit of time in Richardson when we were doing the Zephyrus Wind Ensemble earlier this year. We performed in Richardson. Um, Texans or Cowboys? I don't like the foosball. Were Was I at TBA this year? No, I've never been to a TBA conference. Conferences are expensive, and being a composer doesn't make a lot of money. So eventually, though, eventually. But back to Sarrusophones. Interestingly, do I have that book next to me? Uh, no, it's somewhere else. But um, one of the earliest American treatises for the wind band was Clapey's, and I can't remember the exact title. It's The Wind Band and Its Instruments, or something along those lines. And Clapey was the director of West Point, the West Point Band. And he spoke glowingly about the Sarrusophone family. Particularly, he really wanted to incorporate things like the alto and tenor Sarrusophone into the modern wind band. He was fairly successful in incorporating the contrabass Sarrusophone into the wind band. It's probably through his suggestion that all of the Army bands after 1919 had to have a Sarrusophone included in their lineup. And I think that was fully implemented by about 1922 when C.G. Kahn was able to finally manufacture their American-made Sarrusophones, of which about 300 were made. We don't know the exact numbers on that, but they pop up every now and then, and they're not terribly difficult to get a hold of if you know where they are and know who has one. Learning to play them is a little bit more difficult, but the contrabasses can provide an interesting tone color. I have called for contrabass Sarrusophone. Back when I was an undergrad, I did a big orchestral piece. I wrote a whole setting of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I had a Sarrusophone in there. And I used the Sarrusophone as the depiction of the evil forest monster Humbaba, which was quite fun, and I got to play the Sarrusophone part in that. Is Zephyr still going? Do you still have new music written for you? At the moment, we're kind of on a hiatus. Unfortunately, our personnel director quit, and I've kind of been in limbo on that. So we were supposed to be doing another concert here in a couple of weeks. We were supposed to be doing my Symphony Number 2, and that has been fully canceled. So yeah, my Symphony 2 is not getting premiered anytime soon. Yeah, it is what it is. We're working through that, so you know, maybe it's for the best for now. Who knows? We'll see. All right, guys. So that kind of sums up the oboes. As far as oboes higher, than those currently built, the piccolo or soprano oboes. Uh, if you go any smaller than those instruments, it becomes extremely difficult, one, to manufacture. Two, you actually run into a problem of physics with the reed, in that reeds won't vibrate any higher than the notes produced by the larger instrument. So it doesn't make much sense to make the instruments any smaller. The smallest oboes I've ever heard mentioned, there was something called a pastoral oboe. Tree Bear made them in the late 1800s. And, excuse me, the smallest pastoral oboes were pitched in A flat. So even a perfect fourth above the E flat oboe. How successful those were can be, we can pretty much say they weren't successful because, one, there aren't any really left around. Two, there's no music written for them. So, interesting experiment. Probably something best left alone because we're getting too small of an instrument to really function. You start raising the question of, because you can doesn't mean you should. Yeah, well, there's a creative composer can always find a use for a new tone color. I love experimenting with a new tone color. However, there is this line between experimenting with a new color and then trying to use an instrument that doesn't function very well. And I ran into this when I was doing Symphony 2. The earliest drafts of Symphony 2, The Forest of Dreams, had an A flat piccolo clarinet part in it. And I was going to include, an A flat clarinet in it. And my friend who had one at the time got it, and we were really communicating back and forth on it. And lo and behold, the instrument he had couldn't work. The upper register was half a step off from the lower register, so the instrument couldn't play in tune with itself. So at once I realized that even the players I know who have the instrument itself is faulty. So at that point, I scrapped that part, rewrote those sections, and made the E flat clarinet player a little less happy. But you do what you do. There wasn't anything major lost there. All right, guys. Let's see. We have any more questions on oboes before we turn to bassoons? All right, well, I guess we can turn to bassoons now, and probably, but not at the moment. Yeah, so let's turn to bassoons. Bassoons are interesting. What, if anything, would you improve upon the bassoon? Okay, so from a mechanical point of view, the bassoon is the least developed of all the woodwind instruments by a long shot. It needs to have a better octave and venting mechanism. Its venting mechanism is one of the poorest designs from a functional point of view. Essentially, the saxophone is the simplest, most elegant design for a octave system. You press one key, it does everything you need. On the bassoon, 1, 2, 3, 4 keys, and then a half-hole mechanism. So basically 4 different mechanisms on the bassoon to accomplish what one key on the saxophone does. That same one key on the clarinet. So that has been solved somewhat by the flickless bassoon that Arthur Weisberg developed before he passed away. That's starting to get a little bit of traction. Most of the stuff is just like ergonomics. The more you start tampering, though, with some of the acoustics of the bassoon, the less it sounds like a bassoon. So there are some, you can only push it so far before it loses the bassoon-like characteristics. So fixing octave ventings on there is probably the most important thing. Anyway, so bassoon section in the wind band. I think it may be the most um, um, uh, underutilized, underdeveloped section within the wind band. Partly because composers just haven't paid much attention to it. Fundamentally broken, but in a good way. Oboe's not much better, half all back octave key, side octave key. Yeah, but oboes at least make sense and you use them as real octave keys. Maybe you had a ring system to the finger holes, an automatic octave key mechanism like on bass clarinet. Yeah, I mean, that's... Well, a ring... We already have rings on the bassoon, on a couple of the keys. There, you can extend that a little bit further. There's one more ring key you can add that works really well. But yeah, if you study the design of the flickless bassoon, it's an extremely complicated mechanism for the process. Okay, so yeah, back to bassoons in the wind band. So typically the bassoons are really treated kind of like the redheaded stepchildren of the wind band. They are given the bass line because a lot of composers just don't know what to do with them and say, oh, well, bass is in the title, let's just put them on the bass line. And that's kind of a bad place to put them. Bassoons, despite the name, is really, of course, a tenor instrument. So band composers forget this. And in fact, I think a lot of band composers forget that the tenor register even exists at all. Okay, good question, Emily. What uses would you recommend for the second bassoon in a band or orchestra? All right, so the second bassoon... Okay, so it depends on how many bassoons you have. We're going to assume it's just 2 bassoons, no contrabassoon. So the second bassoon, typically within the wind section, is going to provide the bass line. It is the bass instrument. First bassoon is not. First bassoon is your tenor. So, second bassoon, bass, first bassoon, tenor. However, if you have a bass clarinet in there, so let's add our bass clarinet. Bass clarinet takes the bass. Second bassoon is now harmony to first bassoon. So first bassoon and second bassoon are now freed from the bass line, and they can play harmony with each other. They can hand off lines. Second bassoon is an interesting one to deal with. So obviously the lowest number bassoon you have, well, actually, it should be the highest number. So if you have bassoon 4, it's obviously the lowest, and it's the bass member. But if there's a lower clarinet, though, it's the bass. All right, Alligator Alley by Michael Dougherty has a fantastic bassoon part. Yes, and the reason for that is he wrote that piece for his daughter. And his daughter was a bassoonist at the time, maybe still is, I don't know. But he wanted her to have something to play in her junior high or high school band. I can't remember which it was. And so he wrote that piece and said, well, the bassoon players need to have something. Michael Dougherty is well known among bassoonists. Perhaps his most famous piece overall is his bassoon solo, Dead Elvis. Dead Elvis is hilarious and bloody difficult, too. It is a takeoff of Stravinsky's L'Histoire du Soldat. The Soldier's Tale, wherein the soldier sells his soul to the devil. And I can't remember what for, but to be able to play the violin. Well, in Dougherty's Dead Elvis, Elvis sells his soul to the record label in order for fame, and Elvis is portrayed by the bassoonist. It's kitschy, and it's meant to be. Well, let's get real here. If you have two worlds to consider in modern concert band lit. You have the world of Michael Dougherty's and you have the educational world. There's separate discussions. Yeah, they are and they aren't. That Michael Dougherty piece was written for an educational group. And so that kind of spoils that idea there. Um, so yeah, you absolutely need to have good bassoon parts in educational music, and here's why. And I'm going to speak from the point of view of somebody who went through the educational system as a bassoonist. As my teacher told me when I was in 7th grade, they put the smartest kids on the bassoon and they give them the easiest music. That right there is a recipe for disaster. You will lose students pretty quickly. He said, I'm bored. I'm going to go hit something in the percussion section. Or I'm going to stop band and go play volleyball. So you see that happen surprisingly more often than we care to admit. So it would actually be really good for educational composers to start putting in much more important bassoon parts. That will keep the players interested. It will force band directors to make sure they have bassoon players. What's your opinion on adding a saxophone section as opposed to a solo instrument as part of the orchestral tutti? It is a fantastic sound. The pieces that have a saxophone section that are really well incorporated into them are magical. I would look at something like Ralph Vaughan Williams' Symphony No. 9, Bela Bartok's the Wooden Prince. Look at Vincent Dandy's Pomme de Rivage. Those are great examples where an entire saxophone section is incorporated into the ensemble to great effect. I went through the same system as an oboist, and you and I are both talking about Texas. Texas is not the rest of the country. Yeah, but you know what? Texas makes up a big part of the music education system within the United States, for better or worse. I mean, in other parts of the country, a lot of music education programs are dying, but they look to the Texas system as where they want to be. And I will say this: while I grew up in the Texas system, the majority of my time was spent in small school bands. So my junior and senior year, my band had a total of 40 people in it. I was the only bassoonist. It does, but you absolutely can't write for T's. You can aspire all you want, but you have to deal with what you have. Yeah, you have to deal with what you have, but I think a lot of Texas. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, um, so I think a lot of that will have to do with the band director, and I've seen this a lot of times with band directors who have given up. They just want to take the easy route, and I saw this in my own programs when I was growing up. If you are not trying to push forward, you are either dying or you're regressing back to the mean. And that is not a good situation to be in. I think a good program should always be right on the forefront of what's happening. And I have talked to a lot of players who say, yeah, if you want to push it forward, you need to start doing things better by your double reeds. I had a great conversation with the oboe section of the Dallas Winds. And I did that actually for a podcast, and they were saying, our oboe players are getting bored. We've got to give them something better to do. Okay, so I've got a lot to catch up with. This might be a hard question to answer in this format, but what are your opinions on wind band seating arrangement? It seems like every band I've played arranges things differently. Yes, and there is no good answer on that. And you're right, this is not a great format for it. When I do the second edition of Volume 1 of Band Orchestration, I am going to devote a whole brand new chapter to seating arrangements in the wind band. Because I think that is a really important topic to tackle. And one of the reasons it's difficult to tackle is that no two wind bands will have the exact same instrumentation. So, yeah. Here in Alberta, the government decided to combat the dying music programs by reallocating schools to have different themes. Some schools will be sports, some science, some music, etc. That's a terrible idea. That means you've taken away the opportunity from some students to give it to others. And you can't do that. That's separate but equal. We call that segregation in the South. Are we going to have a stream like this for recorders? There's some of my favorite instruments. I'm not even going to pronounce that word. Of Baroque and Renaissance style instruments we see now makes me sad. We can absolutely do a recorder live stream. I'd be all for that. My conductor puts the flutes on his left side, maybe because he's deaf in his left ear and doesn't want to hear the piccolo in his right side and be deaf in two ears. Alberta sucks. Okay. It was an absolutely awful, yeah, awful idea, and everyone hated it. Okay, yeah. So I live in LA now and work in the sales department at Alfred. I have a good chunk of the U.S. as part of my territory, and I constantly had to learn the state programs across the country. None of this is as simple as saying the composers don't know how to write for double reeds. Oh, no, you're right. That said, there are plenty of composers who do not know how to write for double reeds, and I played a lot of that music. And there are... I will say this, I don't think most band directors know how to write for double reeds very well. There are a few exceptions to that. David Maslanka was one of the few band composers who really could write eloquently and well for the double reeds. Other composers, it doesn't seem to be part of their palette. Frank DeKelly does not write for double reeds well. Neither does John Mackey. It's not particularly part of their color palette. They want much more bombastic, all this brass and stuff. And so the more delicate woodwind colors are just not there. And we're not just talking educational stuff. We're talking the advanced collegiate stuff as well. It kills me when I see flutes and piccolo on the second row. You know what? I have seen piccolo on second row a lot of times. I know the Dallas Winds will put their piccolo on the second row, and they do that kind of for a balance reason. Because it's a little bit further back, it just deadens the sound just a little bit. Typically, I do prefer flutes on the left-hand side of the conductor, if we're still talking that. And that was something that was, taught to me by my first college band director. It's like, yeah, you put the flutes on the left side because their sound points out. Makes sense. Yeah, economic factors are probably one of the biggest issues with so much of the, I think, poor quality in a lot of educational band music. There are very few educational band pieces that are really going to stand the test of time. And the pieces that do stand the test of time were probably not written to be educational pieces. Music for a Festival by Philip Spark has an amazing bassoon solo. Yeah, Philip Spark is one of those that does know what he's doing with the double reeds. I remember I played dance movements in high school in the all-state band, And the second movement of Dance Movement solidified for me that Spark knows what he is doing when it comes to double reads. It is just phenomenal writing. That said, the fourth movement, I don't think he knew what he was doing with the bassoons, because there's a lick in the fourth movement that is just nasty, and I tried relearning it for grad school. Like, no, not happening. But, yeah. So yeah, dealing with double reads does tend to get a little contentious. My thing is, it's extremely difficult to write within the current restrictions of the educational sound. Fun to play, fun to listen to, and all at the same time. You're absolutely right. That is very difficult. All right. Did it just freeze on everybody, or was that just my computer doing that? Hopefully, we're good though. You're right, and I will say this: writing a okay, good. Writing an educational piece and is extremely difficult to do. I have written one educational piece, and it's a piece for solo bassoon and what would basically be a junior high band. Still looking for someone to perform it if they want. But yeah, it is difficult, and I am not well suited to that kind of writing. I think you need to first, in order to do that, almost be a pedagogue, be a teacher first, and then a composer second, because you have to think along those lines. But then, in that regard, if you're a teacher first and a composer second, the composition's going to suffer. So, it's such a hard line to draw there. Okay, you want to get back to talking double reed stuff? So let's talk. Soon says a low A, it's almost the entire movement. Let's not talk Frank Tickeli, or Frank Tickely as he was once known. No. It's important to hear, especially for someone who works within the publishing industry. You know, there's a reason I self-publish my stuff. You know, nobody's going to publish the kind of stuff that I compose, because I do think so outside of the box, because I really feel very passionately about this stuff, that I want better band music. I don't want this stuff that all sounds the same, and that's one of the reasons I have the YouTube channel. It's educational, but Cafe 512... I don't know that piece. I don't know that composer either. So that'll be one I'll have to look up. Anyway, let's talk contrabassoon. So, yeah, it's the traditional big name publishing companies are. I think they're really starting to take a hit, because people can self-publish now, and I think because we can self-publish, I have a feeling that could be a really good thing for overall creativity. With the amount of resources that are available to composers right now, we should be living in a golden age of composition. We're not, though, and that it's what we've got the classical era, the romantic era, the baroque era. Well, here I tend to call what we're in right now the epic era, and I've had to do this a lot when I've worked on some video game music. The stuff that gets written for orchestra, for movie scores or video game scores is terrible. It's the Hans Zimmer effect. It's there to have an emotional impact, but not an intellectual one. So it's loud, it's low, it's epic. You see all this with epic tracks. What would you suggest for writing sheet music slash scores? If I use Finale, a lot of people use Sibelius. A lot of people are going to Dorico. Um, um, it depends. It really depends on what you want. I would pick one of those three. I would not suggest using Muse Score. I know that's the free one. It looks like trash. If you, so I'll say this. Um, when we were doing the composition competition for the Zephyrus Wind Ensemble, we had a couple of pieces submitted via Muse Score, and basically, the moment we saw it, we said, "We're not looking at that. The engraving is not good. We can't. We're not going to spend our rehearsal time reading off of that." And that's kind of my experience with it. I've Muse Score is for beginners and learning, but I would not use it professionally. Yeah, it's Muse Score is kind of like Notepad. It's it's not something that you're going to be writing a novel on. It's something you take notes on. Um, I Thomas, what I would suggest is if you start using something like Sibelius or Finale, you will see how much different the music will look in those programs, and it's night and day. The just the aesthetic look, and that aesthetic look really does go a long way. Okay, I missed Tunarths. Hal Leonard just a month ago released their own self-publishing platform called Arrange Me, and everyone is watching it very carefully to see what happens there. Um, and yeah, and I know J.W. Pepper has something similar too that I'd like to look at. Alfred uses Finale for just about everything with the exception of the choral department because the head choral guy is a diehard Sibelius user. Yeah, I don't like using Sibelius because I've used Finale now for over 20 years, and Sibelius and Finale have backwards notation input from one another, and I like using the Finale notation input. Muse Score isn't the worst thing, especially for the price, but it's kind of annoying how bad your scores look no matter how hard you try. Yeah, this I have seen one decent looking Muse score, and that was because the person who submitted it to me is evidently spent a lot of time just honing in on the aesthetic of it. Uh, Muse Score is really bothersome to make anything look decent, and it's also missing a whole bunch of features. Like a while ago, I had to install a third-party plugin for the harp pedal diagrams. You know, Finale doesn't natively do harp pedaling diagrams either. You have to get that from a third party as well, and that's a big downside to Finale. But there are some ways around it. I'm on Sibelius' side. I've used it since the beginning. I just can't use the Finale. Yeah, and I think that's kind of how it is. If you start with Finale, you love Finale. If you start with Sibelius, you love Sibelius. And I don't think one is inherently better than the other. Um, so Sibelius, I think, is probably better for engraving overall, and I like Finale better for actually composing. I can compose quickly in Finale. I can't compose quickly into Sibelius. But if I want to clean up some engraving and have it really look nicely, I may import it over into Sibelius. The instrument selection in Muse Score is really limited too. Been using Muse Score for like 8 years now. Going to be an adjustment. Sibelius is exclusively in the film industry. I don't think so. I actually think the Finale is actually a lot more used in the film stuff. I know that Joanne Kane, the big film studio that does a lot of copyist work, uses really fairly exclusively Finale. But a lot of the video game stuff is Sibelius, so it really just depends. Um, Music score has five kinds of alpha Clyde. Why? Crescendo, the right percussion class. It's because music score only uses one voice for all the clarinets. Yeah, my guess is Muse Score is just using general MIDI, and the general MIDI is the standard, 128 samples you get like on your built-in Casio keyboard. Um, yeah, and I'm betting that that is just like patch number 72 on your MIDI keyboard. It's all one clarinet. It doesn't matter. They're not actual samples. So yeah, as Tunar said, back to the contrabassoon. That was a diversion there. I know from the orchestration online group, don't ever get off on tangents on music notation software. That's a can of worms right there. Okay, so contrabassoon. Contrabassoon, as I said earlier, has really in the last really 20 years, it's really started to take off. Is an accessible instrument for your top tier wind bands. Um, Here in Texas, a lot of the top really big high schools have started getting contrabassoons, which to me is really amazing because when I was in high school, contrabassoon was a mythical instrument that you didn't get to even touch, let alone say, "Oh yeah, my high school has a contrabassoon." How biggie? Um, So yeah, it's interesting to see kind of how that's really developed here in the last 20 years, and really probably within the last 10 years. I'm curious, has anybody else in watching now seen that kind of development in other parts of the country? Because the friend I was talking to is now up in he's in Iowa, and do I know if Clear Lake High School has one? I don't know Clear Lake High School. Sorry, I don't even know what state that's in. Would you prefer if solely contrabassoons or contrafortes be used, or have a combination of both? Okay, so contrabassoon versus contraforte. My contention is they are the same instrument, just in different configurations. I don't see a fundamental difference between a contraforte and a contrabassoon. Contrabassoon has just had this really long evolution that um, has had so many different variables along the way, and the contraforte is just one variable. If you look at the 1800s, before Heckel came out with the contrabassoon that we now think of as standard, we've got the contrabassophone, we've got metal contrabassoons, there's the French contrabassoon, there's a Viennese contrabassoon. Um, there were so many different forms of the contrabassoon, and they all sounded different to one another. That today, the fact that we have gotten so used to having the one contrabassoon, once another instrument came out, well, it's a throwback to the late 1800s, really, where we had several forms. All right, in Alberta, there's maybe a single school-owned contrabassoon, and the University of Alberta has the only school-owned bass saxophone in the country. Are you sure about that being the country? Because I bet there are other uh, ones out there. Adds contrabassoon to beginner band. I wouldn't. In high school in the early 1980s, just having an English horn at the time really put you a cut above the rest. Contrabassoons were not seen in high school level back then. Oh yeah, absolutely agree. I was in high school in the late 90s. I was out in East Texas for a while, and our high school had an English horn, and we would use it occasionally. But yeah, English horns are becoming pretty standard for your top high schools, your really big high school groups. In Minnesota, I haven't seen any contrabassoons in high school. Probably doesn't surprise me. No contrabassoons in West Virginia. Yeah, well, West Virginia also had that big teacher strike within the last year where, they can't fund the schools. So that doesn't surprise me for West Virginia. I don't even know if there's contrabassoons in middle school. No, you shouldn't be having a contrabassoon in middle school. I have, however, seen a brand new Selmer contrabass clarinet in a fancy suburban high school. Yeah, I've seen that before. That makes me imagine an English horn contrabassoon duet piece. Write it. I bet you could find some adventurous contrabassoon players out there who would do it. In Japanese high school bands, contrabassoons are becoming increasingly common too. Yeah, the Japanese band program. I wish I knew more about what all was going on in some of the Japanese programs. So why, if the bassoon itself needs still mechanical development, is attention being given to developing contrabassoons? Okay, so the bassoon needs development. That's not to say the contrabassoon doesn't need development too. The contrabassoon is in even a worse state than the bassoon is. Let that sink in. So the Heckel contrabassoon, as we know it, and not just those made by Heckel, but all those of that same design, are not acoustically great instruments. And we've known this since they came out, but there's like, well, we don't need them to be any better than they are. They're just playing whole notes and half notes, occasionally some quarter notes. So the demand was not there to develop the instrument to the point where it would be capable of playing the same kind of material that any of the other wind instruments could play. Well, now we've said, well, hang on. Why do we have to suffer when we could fix the instrument? So there's been a couple different approaches with that. One is the Fox Fast system, developed as a collaboration between the Fox Double Reed Company and Arlen Fast, who's the contrabassoonist of the New York Philharmonic. And they have redesigned the octave venting mechanism on the Heckel system contrabassoon. And in doing so, they've added a bunch of vents, moved some stuff around, and have kept basically the same instrument there, but added like 6 extra keys. That's one way of doing it. Guntram Wolf took a different route. He said, okay, I can put new vents on here to fix the problem, but that's putting a band-aid on it. I need to build a better system. So he redesigned everything from the ground up using modern design technology, collaboration between both Guntram Wolf, Benedict Eppelsheim, as well as Professor Grundmann, who is a professor of aerodynamics at, I believe, University of Dresden. Don't quote me on that, but an aerodynamics professor at any rate. And they just redesigned the acoustics of it to say, okay, well, we're going to have it where it does the octaves perfectly. It does this, this, this. I prefer the contraforte only because it's so easy to play. You know, when I've played it before, it's just, oh, that's easy. I don't have to work. I like not having to work. How similar are the fingerings and keywork on the contrabassoon and bassoon? They're the same except for the octave venting. There's no whisper key on the contrabassoon. You have 2 octave vents, whereas on bassoon you flick the vents. So if you don't know what that is for the non-bassoonists in the room, flicking is when you briefly touch one of the octave vents and then let it go, just like in Frozen. On the contrabassoon, they are just straight up octave keys. You press them down and hold them like you would on a saxophone. In that regard, the contrabassoon probably has a superior mechanism there. But because of the size of the instrument, 2 vents are not enough. So the bigger the instrument is, the more octave vents you have to have. Okay, so let's see. We have any other questions on contrabassoon? So that sounds kind of sick. I'm not sure what you mean there. Is that the new lingo for sick? I'm old. I'm a Luddite. I still read Shakespeare and Plato. Do I think Richard Bobo's subcontrabassoon will have the same problems? Knowing Richard, right now, I don't think he's very concerned with the octave venting system. He has multiple designs in place on the subcontrabassoon. The original one that he's going to be installing will be a simplified system to have a couple of vents. If the prototype proves to be successful, he has the design to add a larger number of vents to the instrument, and you can retrofit them on there fairly easily. Octave vents are not going to be too difficult to put in, particularly if he's going to use the bicycle cables that I know he's using for the low keys. I'm not sure if he's going to use those for the octave vents or not. The bicycle cables are what Wolf uses for the contraforte to get its octave vents. So it would logically assume that Richard might do the same thing, though he might not. I've not looked in detail at that part of the subcontrabassoon design. Since we're on subcontrabassoon, let's just go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room, if you will, because elephants can produce those same sounds that Richard will be able to in the subcontrabassoon. I'm curious. I know that it is one of the most hotly watched instrument building programs or instrument building projects, really pretty much in the world right now, because Richard's doing such a great job of documenting it. What are people's thoughts about extending that range down into that subcontra level? I think it's a fantastic idea. We have used that range in orchestral and band pieces before, but we've only ever had the pipe organ to be able to do that. So to have an acoustic wind instrument be able to do that, I think is a fantastic idea. So what are the room's thoughts on it? I'm very eager to see what composers can do with it. Yeah, I mean, I have written for subcontrabassoon twice. It appears briefly at the very end of my Symphony No. 2, and then I have a pretty extensive part for it in Symphony 3. There's one thing better than subcontrabassoon, and it's a Giga Racket. Remember, Richard did the Giga Racket as a joke. There are people who take that seriously. I love the idea of the subcontrabassoon, and I was quite excited when it was first announced. Yeah, I absolutely agree there. I think I saw, before Richard announced it, he talked briefly in one of his videos about, I think it was the one where he's just putting tubes into his contrabassoon and said, until somebody builds a subcontrabassoon, and that was before he ever announced the project. I'd also like to see an instrument pitch between the bassoon and the contrabassoon. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. This is something that is fascinating here. So let's see, Norse musician. Do you think it would project enough to be felt in a 2D, or would it really make an effect in a smaller texture? Organ is much louder. Yeah, organ's much louder because it's mechanical. You can pump more air through it. I don't think it's going to be, with the subcontrabassoon, I don't think it's going to be any softer than a regular contrabassoon is. So, in as much as the regular contrabassoon can support that, I think the subcontrabassoon would have that same level. So, in a soft passage or a medium passage, I think it will just be this presence there. I think in a loud passage, you might feel it, but you won't hear it. Um, but we're talking hypotheticals here. So it will be interesting to figure out and see what happens with the final product. Um, and honestly, the case study of that piece would be something like my Symphony 2 or Symphony 3, which are large scale works that call for it down at the bottom. Symphony 2, the final note of Symphony 2 has the low B being held out. And it's one of those interesting things. That low B will be literally the lowest note ever heard in a concert hall, because it's half a step below the lowest note of the 32-foot stop of the pipe organ. And there's no 64-foot stop in any concert hall in the world. Um, so, so you've got that note there. So that low B natural. And if that works, it would be just fantastic sound. Okay, back to Puccolo. He asked about an instrument between the bassoon and the subcontra bassoon. Of course, I've got a whole video on this, the missing bassoon. It's actually like my second most watched video on here, and I've never understood why that particular video has been as popular as it is. It's interesting. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go grab a book really quickly. So give me just like 2 seconds. Okay, I am back, and this is Vidor's Manual of Practical Instrumentation. This fairly short instrumentation textbook. Vidor, it was most known as an organist, and this is the textbook that Maurice Ravel would go back and look at. So if Ravel used it, we can trust it. It's pretty succinct. But what's interesting is when he talks about the bassoons. When this was written, let me see if I can get the original date on this. All right, so it does not appear that the original publication date on this is still in here. My guess is the original date is somewhere around 1900. And the reason I say that is how he talks about the contrabassoon. The contrabassoon, they talk about being a very poor instrument and something that does not work very well. And they talk a lot more about the sarrusophone. Well, we know that show me a suspect orchestration in Ravel, and I will be very surprised. Ravel is probably one of the most calculated orchestrators of all time. There are some weirdnesses in there, but his handling of orchestral color and texture is surpassed by no one. So, anyway, this is what Vidor says about an instrument in between the bassoon and the contrabassoon. And he calls it a bassoon quint, basson quint. The basson quint has not yet been made, but bassoon players are calling for it. It would be the true bass of the woodwind group, a fifth below the standard instrument, descending consequently to E flat, a semitone lower than the double bass. The low A, which Wagner wrote below B flat, is admirably rich and full. Then, say professionals, why not descend to E flat with the same fingering and the same capabilities as the ordinary bassoon? We have already seen that the low fifth from double B flat to double F is sufficiently robust to bear any weight of sound. The new low fifth would be still more robust. Bassoon quint is said to be easy of construction. We look forward to instrument makers to provide us with it in the near future. Interestingly, um, um, uh, he wrote this at a time when the contrabassoon itself was not seen in France at all. There were some old instruments. The buffet system had not come out yet. And the buffet system would not come out until about 1912. And it's interesting to talk about Ravel. What's Ravel doing in 1912? He's working on Daphnis and Chloe. And we can see in the manuscript of Daphnis and Chloe places where he says sarrusophone, and then places where he says contrabassoon, showing that right at that time when the new contrabassoon comes out, he's still originally thinking sarrusophone, but very quickly changes to contrabassoon. So yeah, Ravel did call for sopranino saxophone in F. There's a couple of explanations we can have for that. One, it is mentioned in the textbooks. Berlioz talks about it, but Berlioz is talking about it from a time when it was still proposed by Adolphe Sax to be made, and Sax didn't do that. There are, and also at that time when Ravel was working on Bolero, his brain condition that would eventually take his life was really starting to take hold, and so the later stuff of Ravel does start to get a little bit weird. But you know, Bolero is weird in that case. The high Fs in Ballet of Chicks in the Shells on oboe, it might be difficult, but it is exactly the right sound. It's that you do want that strained sound. It might be difficult, but it works. So anyway, yeah. So Vidor was a big proponent of adding in what I would now call a great bass bassoon, or a great bassoon. Others have called it a semi-contrabassoon, but I like the term great bass because it's consistent with the nomenclature going all the way back to the great bass dulcian, which was the predecessor of such an instrument. So if we have that, we could have like a section of, bassoon 1, bassoon 2, great bass bassoon, contrabassoon, and we fill in that little bit of a gap there and treat it like we would treat the contralto clarinet. On the upper end of the bassoon family, I think most people here know that we do have tenor bassoons and alto bassoons that are being used now. Of those, the tenor bassoons are much more reliable, but that said, a truly professional model of those instruments has yet to come out. And I hesitate writing for them, although I have. It would be interesting to see what happens once we finally get a professional model of a smaller bassoon. One of the drawbacks is that they do have a much more limited range. When I had my my F tenor bassoon, the highest note I could play up to a B flat pretty easily, and then a C would I could pop out. Okay, tell you what, I have the score to that sitting right across the room from me. All right, let's just take a look at exactly what you're talking about. Oh, look, Ballet of the Chicks in Their Shells. Um, yeah, I'm going to have to disagree with you. I think that is actually absolutely brilliant orchestration. That held high F in the oboe, I don't see any other instrument that can do that. For that duration, you're not putting that in the flute. It's going to have that just beautiful thin sound up there. You have the octaves up there. Yeah, bada 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 bada. You're not going to get that in any of the other wind instruments. Clarinet's not going to do that. That would be even worse on clarinet. It's it wouldn't work on flute at all. That kind of gesture is not flute-like. So oboe is, yeah, it's the second oboe part. You don't have another instrument that could do it. I mean, you could put it in xylophone, but that's such a different timbre. You could put it in a solo string instrument, but that delicate nature you've got. Yeah, but there's no third oboe. It's the third oboe is on English horn the whole time, so he never has it double. So yeah, it is, it may be difficult, but it is exactly the right sound. I would not change a thing about that passage. So sorry, I will disagree with you there. Uh, yeah, the third oboe isn't playing, but there is no third oboe. It's English horn. So, oh, I'm not playing oboe on it. If anything, I want to play the saxophone part. And honestly, with the saxophone part, the big saxophone solo is designed to be taken by the second oboe player. So the poor second oboe player, if they have to do the saxophone solo as well, though that really rarely happens. Anyway, so back to using the smaller bassoons. I'm one of the advocates for using them, of course. I'm curious what other people think. Could the bassoon family be effectively extended upward by the use of those smaller instruments? Granted, I'll say this. Maybe it'll make a bit of a humble brag, but the only decent videos are still, my couple videos I did years and years ago. Because, very few people are going to take the time to really sit down and treat them like an actual auxiliary woodwind instrument as opposed to a children's instrument. How many smaller bassoons exist? More or fewer than contrabassoons? That is an interesting question. And one I don't think I can rightly answer right now. The thing is, the smaller bassoons exist in larger numbers in Europe. Not so much here in the U.S., but in Europe they do exist in fairly substantial numbers. But those instruments are, by and large, the children's instruments. So they're not going to be fitted with your full key work, and they're not designed to play, at a professional level. Whereas all contrabassoons are deemed professional level instruments. So here in the U.S., finding tenor bassoons is uncommon. I think the bassoon has so much untapped potential in its higher register. The development of new instruments in that register would be fantastic for it. Yeah. Um, what's interesting though is I could play easily higher on the regular bassoon than I could on the tenor bassoon. And also, I just edited last week Christian Omarones's new book on the extended high register, where he can play the bassoon up to G8, which is the G above the piano, which is stupid high. That's a fifth above where the piccolo plays. He should be able to do that in bassoon, but his new book explains how to do it. Anyway, but the bassoon's high range is getting explored more and more. If we could take that same thing and put it on the smaller bassoons, it would be absolutely fantastic. That said, even with um, the regular bassoon, we've got you know a 3 octave range on any wind instrument is really pretty good. Oboe has 2.5, flute has 3. You know, tenor bassoon has 3, and bassoon and garkline together playing the higher part. Um, oh, I mean, I can't play more than an octave and a sixth on my garkline recorder. Yeah, I've seen the. I'm not even going to pronounce his name. I'm sorry. I have seen those videos. Yeah. Yeah, a little different approach there, but yeah, it's. I wish more people would take that instrument seriously. I think it would encourage composers to do so, at the very least, even if it's already possible on the regular bassoon. Yeah. Interestingly, uh, I'd have some extended guard climb fingerings if you might be interested. Sure, send them to me. Um, if you want to find my email, just go to my website, brettnewtoncomposer.com. If you want to just send me an email that way, that's the easiest way. Um, so yeah, back to composers. Um, so I wrote several years ago a what was going to be a concerto for the tenor bassoon, the tenorune. That turned out to be much more of a tone poem, and kind of along the lines of Sibelius' Swan of Tuonela. And I've got someone right now who is interested in performing that piece. We'll see kind of where that goes. I know they bought the sheet music to it recently. Interesting piece. I think I may have put it up on YouTube. Now that was able to get a decent performing version, I ended up doing a lot of rewrites on that piece when they contacted me about it. Garkline is hard to play comfortably because, yeah, I can't play Garkline really at all. My knuckles actually overlap on them. Sopranino, I'm fine with. Um, but my Garkline I bought as a novelty. I paid $22 for it, and that's about all you need to know about Garkline recorder. It's if you are a normal sized human being or larger, you can't play Garkline recorder. Simple as that. Um, okay, let's see. What else do we have going on? All right, I'll open it up now for just random questions. If we want to stick with double read questions, that's fine. Or any other questions you might have. I have been talking straight now for almost 2 hours. Garkline is good for people whose hands are too small for bassoon. Even then, you have to be a small person. Can we have recorder modernization? Sure, I would love to see recorders get modernized. fit them with a berm style fingering. That would be absolutely fantastic. Put an octave vent on them. You know, have keywork for the pinkies. Yeah, I don't see why we can't do that and why it shouldn't be difficult to do. It would be interesting to experiment. Say, take a cheap plastic recorder and then start adding keywork to it. Something simple would be a pinky C sharp or G sharp key, depending on C sharp, G sharp. Yeah, depending on which one it is. So if you're on an alto recorder, it'd be a C sharp key here. That would be really, I think, a wise thing to put on. That's a difficult note to produce otherwise. Um, yeah, I think some kind of modernization would go a long way. Maybe I'll do that. Maybe I will experiment with putting a key on. I've got some. I could buy a cheap plastic alto recorder and experiment with installing a G sharp key. In lieu of full keyword redesign, the left hand pinky bell mechanisms. Yeah. So. A left-hand bell key, basically extending the range of the recorder down half a step. Because to get chromatic into the upper register, you have to do leg stopping, where you close off the bell hole. And extending it down half a step would alleviate that problem, and you could just do it with a key. The whole family were that way. Yeah. I don't see why it wouldn't be difficult. Recorders are not inherently difficult instruments to make. I mean, the hardest thing with recorder design is really just the conical boreway. But adding keys would not be difficult at all. Be something interesting to experiment with. Maybe start off with a 3D printed recorder and kind of work from there. Who knows? Might be interesting. The one big drawback, though, of the recorder I see for use in a more modern group is its lack of dynamics. That a recorder can't change its dynamics easily is going to be its biggest drawback for use in a modern ensemble. I don't even think you really need to worry about making them louder. I think you just need to worry about how to manipulate dynamics, and I don't think there's a good way to do that because the fixed labium, you can't change the dynamics on it. It's just you're going against acoustics there. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I don't think I am. All right, what other questions we got? I know it seems like final comment on it because I can't let it go. You're wrong on there's no English horn. Right, yeah, I know. But he never has the English horn take up the oboe. And so in the whole piece, but it might be okay to divide it between two players, but I don't see the real need for it. So as written, it works beautifully. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bars. You are correct. I stand corrected. And looks like Nomus, he does have it go to oboe 3 for just a brief bit. I was looking just at the okay, yeah, you're right. He does have it. So So maybe you know, that's an error on the title page there. Anyway, um, one thing that you should know, Tunarth, is that there are a lot of errors in the printed score. My friend Michael Feingold is going back and doing a lot of revisions on it, and he's actually uh, he's finding like errors on every page. So he's got the original Ravel manuscript, and it very well could be that that is an error that got into the printed version that's not in the original Ravel manuscript. I'll have to ask him when I talk to him next. And I usually talk to him once a day in the mornings. He's a pretty well-known orchestrator. Um, but yeah, he's got a bunch of the old Ravel manuscripts, and so I will ask him what he says on that. He would know better than anybody. He's actually writing a book on Ravel's orchestration techniques, and so he will know that immediately. On your old website, you were talking about a bass cornet, okay, the travel tuba. I was having a bit of a hard time following that. Can you elaborate your thoughts on the subject? Sure. So basically, the difference between a tuba and a cornet is the amount of conical bore. A cornet is roughly half cylindrical bore, half conical bore, whereas a tuba is all conical bore from the beginning to the end. In the travel tubas, because they are so compact, most of the bore in there is going to be much more cylindrical. Therefore, if we take that bore and make it cylindrical, well, that's kind of our defining characteristic of it being a tuba. And, well, so if we have cylindrical bore now, it's no longer a tuba. It goes to being a member of the cornet family. And so that's the reasoning there. Now, something you will note, I do not include that information in the new book that's coming out. I have a bunch of information on cornets, and I don't mention that instrument in there at all. Um, Simply because I don't mention what are practice instruments designed not for concert use, but just designed to be taken into like a hotel room. So, but that's it would be a good time to bring up the question of composer intention versus practicality. Yeah, and that is always a good thing to talk about. Um, it depends. So, if a composer writes something that's impractical, I have to look at first who the composer is. Is it going to be worth my time as a performer to practice the impractical? If it's worth my time, I'm practicing the impractical. If it's not worth my time and it's not a great piece of music, I'm not going to put in the time. And that may sound callous, it may sound shallow, but that's how a lot of performers are going to think. If it is a Beethoven symphony, you bet your sweet ass I'm putting in the time to practice the difficult licks. Is it a piece of, video game music for an unknown composer or a video game that you'll never hear? I'm not putting in any time to learn that. So it's that I don't even think it's impractical. I wouldn't write a passage like that as Ravel wrote it, but it's Ravel. I'm not going to question too much. Let's see. Why did earlier band scores show E flat horn instead of F horn? No one uses E flat horns anymore. Where would you even buy one? Okay, so the E flat horns, there is they would provide E flat horn parts. Well, in the early band music, some of the horns used were actually in E flat, a step lower. That also would be able to be used by the alto horn, or as the Brits call it, a tenor horn. It was a catch-all part for whoever showed up. Horn players, by the way, know how to transpose. So if they're bringing their F horn, well, guess what? They can just transpose it down a step. That's something horn players um, are known to do. Uh, I think it's all well and good to want to experiment, but it's a matter of I want this lesser used instrument for a very cool sound to make a wonderful moment versus when a lot of people playing my music. Where do you draw the line? Oh, that line. I thought you're still on the Ravel. Um, It depends on the function of the music. Is the function of the music function has to come first, and each piece of music will have a different function. So if I'm writing a symphony, a big symphony, I am my primary concern there is the music. If I'm writing an educational piece, my primary concern is the pedagogy. So I need to focus on what is the function of that music. There's a bunch of stuff. Are there any good video game score? Any video game scores you'd say are good? I like the old Mario. You know, I don't play video games. I am not a video game person. I thought you were talking about E flat alto horns, not something else. Well, it could have very well been E flat alto horns covering those lines. A lot of times it was just whoever showed up to cover those parts. The E flat alto horn for was used a lot in early band music in the United States. You'll also realize that a a lot of that stuff comes from uh, the video game from the British tradition. Oh yeah, I know there are tons of video games with full orchestral scores. I was able to work on one of them last year, 2 years ago. I can't even remember anymore. But um, yeah, no, there are a lot of them, and I will say from the video game that we worked on, and it was a major video game for a major studio, and I can't tell you which one, but it was a really substantial one. We were lucky enough to be able to use woodwinds, which was a big deal at the time. Woodwinds just weren't even used in video games. It was all just strings and brass and MIDI percussion. And by the way, in all video games, it's always MIDI percussion. There's no live percussionists. Trade secret there. Um, that said, I won't say they're very good. They're not. Most of them are not good music. Um, we constantly talked among the orchestrators how bad the music that came through was. Um, the compose what you hear on the final end product is not what got delivered. It was the original stuff was so bad that it gets cleaned up by the orchestrators because the original composers don't know orchestration at all. Um, so yeah. Um, you talked about the lack of an alto, tuba, flugelhorn on your website. Why didn't anyone make an instrument like this? As a brass player, I'd personally love to play one. Okay, so the alto flugelhorn, alto euphonium, alto tuba. Love that you mentioned this. I just finished doing a slight rewrite of that section in the book yesterday. By the way, if you don't know, my new book on brass instruments is going to be coming out very, very soon. This is the manuscript. This is just brass instruments, by the way. And I do have a pretty substantial section in here talking about an alto tuba, alto flugelhorn, that kind of stuff. They do exist. They are very rare, though. Um, it is one of those instruments that I absolutely think should be made. Um, One of the things that I've talked to, and I've sent an email to an instrument company that I'm not going to talk about that right now. Um, and I was asking just for some photos for the book, and I casually mentioned, I'm a composer. I'm wondering if your company would ever like to, collaborate with composers on developing some new instruments. And the immediate reply I got back was, yes, we want to do that. So, one of the things that I would do is essentially an alto euphonium, basically pitched in E flat or F, 4-valve compensating, so 3 up here, 1 on the side. Basically, a large, wide bore alto horn. It would need a specially designed mouthpiece for it, funnel cup, all that stuff. But it would not be terribly difficult to do. You could use a lot of already pre-existing parts. Hopefully, though, I'll be able to get in communication with that company a little bit more. Maybe I'll be able to talk about that a little bit further. That's still just like pipe dream, though. We'll see what happens there, but that would be an absolutely fascinating thing to develop. Would be a true alto euphonium. I don't think that anybody's really ever discussed that. There is a video that I am planning on making where that instrument will get addressed. I am going to be doing at some point a video on what is a sax horn. Because I have become fascinated with the history of sax horns and the fact that we got it wrong. There is a huge bit of information that got left out of the sax horn story that it's wrong in every textbook you've ever seen. And so it's gonna be absolutely fascinating once I do that video. And it's not my original research. It's all from a dissertation I have. Oh, by the way, this is a photo of such an instrument. This is an actual alto euphonium. This is an early one. I believe it's made by Diston. Let me get the right word order there. But that's an alto euphonium. Is there going to be a percussion book after the brass one is wrapped up? Yes. So volume 4 of band orchestration is going to be percussion and all the auxiliary instruments. So that includes piano, celeste, double bass, cellos. Okay. So yeah, that will come in a few years' time, probably another 2 years. The immediate project after Volume 3 is finished, the brass book, I'm going to go back and revisit Volume 1 again and do a second edition on that because there's a bunch of stuff I'd like to correct and change. Veering back to the topic of expanding the double reed, I have a question that's been eating me for quite some time. Why are all the modern double reed instruments conical bored? Okay, aside from the Renaissance racket, I can't think of a single cylindrical double reed instrument off the top of my head. Okay, so yeah, there are crumb horns, of course, and the cornemuse. A modern cylindrical bore double reed instrument, I think absolutely could be a thing. Basically, you'd use clarinet-style fingerings with a double reed mouthpiece. And such an instrument would not be terribly difficult to construct. I know in personal communication with Richard Bobo, he has designed such an instrument. I think that Jared DeLeon has designed an instrument like that as well. It would be interesting. It absolutely would. It could be this fantastic new tone color. I would not do it in the style. I would not do an instrument in the style of the racket, just because it's stupidly difficult to make one of those. Or I wouldn't do it in the crumb horn either because, again, not a really great shape to work with. I think I'd probably hear a really interesting tone quality. Where can I hear one of those instruments being played? Just Google crumb horn or YouTube crumb horn. There's a lot of great videos of crumb horn being played. I remember seeing an early 20th century ad for a sax-keyed oboe. Okay, I happen to have volume 2 of band orchestration right here. And it just so happens that on page 144, and I've got 2 oboes here. The one on the right-hand side is a sax oboe. The one on the left is a Viennese oboe. So this is the sax oboe. It's got saxophone-like fingerings, and they do exist. So there is actually a very weird version of that. Google search baritone sax oboe, and there is a single instrument out there that was made in the key of E flat. Basically the same pitch as the alto sax, that is in E flat, a step lower than the English horn and a minor third above the bass oboe. So it's this weird instrument that's fitting in between the English horn and the bass oboe. And Peter Hurd, who runs oboe service, called it a baritone sax oboe. After like the baritone sax, because it's an E flat, it's closer in pitch to the baritone oboe, which would be the bass oboe or the heckelphone. And nobody knows where this instrument came from. Even the oboe historians are like, it's fully fledged. It's not a prototype. It is the weirdest thing. So nobody knows. It's weird. An E flat English horn, but with saxophone fingerings. It's bizarre. All right, guys. Any other questions? That would be E flat English horn would be a really interesting instrument to explore. If it were made, with standard oboe fingerings, step lower than the English horn, maybe for second English horn parts. Who knows? It could be interesting. One topic that was touched on briefly earlier. Okay, ensemble seating. So typically, if I am going to do a wind ensemble, here's how I'm going to do it. So I've got my conductor here. As I'm facing, if I'm the conductor facing ensemble, to my left on the front row, I want my flutes. And to the right of them, I want the oboes. I don't want my clarinets on the front row. I'm actually going to be using orchestral seating. So I'm going to put the clarinets on the second row and the third row. And then bassoons on the second row behind the oboes. So I want bassoons and oboes in 2 rows, oboes in front, bassoons in the second row. Behind the bassoons, I'm going to put my saxophones. So 3 rows of woodwinds, flutes and oboes in first row, clarinets and bassoons on the second row, clarinets and saxophones on the third row. That way, all the woodwinds are together. Horns you need to place on the conductor's left-hand side, and that's pretty standard across all ensembles. Horns need to go on the left-hand side of the conductor because that's where their bell points. And so we've got horns over there. In the dead center, you really should have your trumpets, and depending on the ensemble, you may want the trombones behind them, or you want the trombones over to the right of them. So you have a row of trumpets, dead center, trombones over to the right of the conductor. And then you can put your tubas behind them. Or if you've got your trumpets dead center, you put your trombones behind them. Then your tubas over here. Pretty much whatever you're going to do, your tubas are going to be to the right of center of the conductor. I can't ever imagine a situation where you want your tubas over to the left of center of the conductor. when I went to my college orientation, their seating was woodwinds on the left and brass on the right, and I wanted to cry. Okay, there is a tradition to this. The Guard Republican band in Paris. This was their setup for a piece like Dionysiacs, and it absolutely makes sense. So, first clarinets, second clarinets on the conductor's left, big section of 12 each. So they're seated where the violins are. First violin, second violins, or first clarinet, second clarinets. Okay? In the center where the violas are would be the saxophones. And over on the right-hand side would sit the sax horns. So your flugelhorns, your euphoniums, and your tubas, where the cellos would be. That was their original setup. Now, in the center, behind the saxophones, would be the rest of the woodwinds. The flutes, the oboes, the bassoons, and the solo clarinets. Why? Because that's exactly where they would be in the orchestra. So it is a bizarre setup that you actually have clarinets in two spots. And this was the French setup in the early 20th century. Why should tubas always be on the right, just to be with the trombones? The tubas are on the right because the horns are on the left. And it's just a space issue. Because the horns are over here, we're now out of space. We've got to go over here for our tubas. And that's just as simple as that. So typically, in the orchestral setup, the bass sound always comes from the conductor's right. So tuba is on the orchestral right side. So in the band, they're on the right side as well. Now, sometimes in younger bands, you might see them in the center, but you almost never see tubas left of center. And it's, even in the British brass band, they're center. They're never on the left. So it's either center or on the right for tubas. And that's just one of those that you don't even really question. That's just where that sound comes from. So one of the biggest things is your position on the front row. The Dallas Winds uses on the front row a row of 8: 2 oboes, 2 flutes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, and I've subbed in that group once. It's weird. The first oboe player and the first bassoon player need to communicate to each other, and they're sitting directly across from each other. They can see each other, but they can't do a lot of communication. So it's a little difficult to work with that. In my band, the bari saxes sit with the tubas, and the altos tenors are separated by the horn section. Yeah, that's not a good setup. The saxophones always need to be together in an ensemble. What are my thoughts on the so-called superbones? They're a gimmick. They could be used creatively. It's not something you need to really worry about. I think I may mention them in half a sentence in the upcoming book. My college bands, we horns sit on the right side pretty close to the tubas and euphoniums. Weird. Yeah, horns on the right side is almost unheard of. Superbones are trombones that are both valve trombones and slide at the same time. So you get a set of 3 valves here for the left hand, and then on the right you've got your slide. Maynard Ferguson is about the only person who ever used one. They're not real. They're gimmicks. Theo, I don't understand how that would work very well. It's not. It makes no sense to put the horns on the right side. Because if you put the horns on the right side, the sound of the horn is going back into the ensemble. The sound of the horn needs to go out to the audience. So, yeah, the sound of the horns, they're not triggered. It's just stupid. That's a band director who didn't think through things. Her sound bounces off the back wall, sound shells, and then to the audience. It's also 7. Okay, yeah, there is one group that does that. The University of Michigan does that. And if you've got 7, yeah, that might work. But if you're using a standard section, you don't want your horns on the right side. I'm wondering if they follow the University of Michigan situation. Do you think alto saxophones should switch parts like trumpets and clarinets? I don't know what you mean there. What do you mean by switch parts? That may be just something specific to your band, Bassoonist One. So that's not a typical situation. Our teacher requested it. I don't know. It's... you know, I talk about horn seating arrangements in the book. Play different parts on different pieces. No, you don't do that typically in bands. There's a reason that you are seated where you are. You're put there for your strengths. Trumpet players, you absolutely do not want a third trumpet player playing a lead trumpet part. They simply won't have the range to do it. Saxophones, it doesn't really make much sense because first alto sax, second alto sax are really usually pretty equal parts. Your clarinets probably shouldn't be switching parts either. That's something that's just independent to your band, Bassoonist One. I've heard that with horns on the left, the audience gets too much low horn. There's no such thing as too much low horn. No, you want more low horn. Give me low horn. So if you have a section of 5 horn players, I would actually rather have that 5th horn player on 4th rather than on 1st like it's traditionally done. But unless you've got like these mammoth horn players, you want more low. Exactly. Yeah, low horn players tend to take great pride in what they can do. They don't want the high horn parts. Yeah, yeah, and so horns with euphoniums is interesting. So University of North Texas has their horns on the left, and then right next to them are the euphoniums. The tubas are still on the right side, though. So the euphoniums are over here, the tubas are over here. They're not connected. So Eugene Corporon says the euphonium is much closer in relationship to the horn than it is to the tubas. So that's an interesting thing there. Euphonium is difficult. One of the things that I do in my larger pieces is I actually do an actual seating chart. Do I know any really good width ensembles? I think you mean wind ensembles there. I can see here in Houston. Go to the University of Houston. They have a great wind ensemble program. You can go see one of their programs do it. I don't know if there are any professional wind ensembles there. It wouldn't surprise me, but I have not heard of one. But yeah, the University of Houston is a really noted wind ensemble program. I think for the past couple of years they've been working with an interim director, but it will be interesting. Yeah. Well, Eddie Green's legacy, from what I hear, may not be there much longer. I've heard rumors of who they may be hiring, and he would be like an anti-Eddie Green there. That would be interesting. I am not, by the way, the Eddie Green school of band. I do not like his philosophy there. Out of curiosity, we clarinets had a weird arrangement last semester. I'm curious what you think about it. Basically, we had 2 had a row of seconds going back a row, and a row of firsts going back to their right. I Vincent, I can't visualize it. What you're saying there. So back in the 70s and 80s, everybody was all about Eddie Green. Um, okay, so the Eddie Green philosophy is you start your this I hated this because I came from a tradition that was not um, like this in undergrad, and I moved to this tradition in grad school. So um, um, basically, the Eddie Green philosophy was you started your band rehearsal with the fundamental warm ups, which is fantastic for a junior high and a high school band. Um, it was like lots of F's around the room and whole notes and rhythms and bopping and all this stuff, which is fantastic for school groups. Not for college groups though, because by the time you get to a college level, I think you need to be treating your musicians much more professionally. I'm not expecting to go into an orchestra rehearsal and do F around the room. I would often feel like when I was in grad school, um, um, when we were doing that kind of stuff, the Eddie Green philosophy, it's like, okay, yeah, I warmed up before I got here. I'm good to go. Like, okay, but and I don't think it made a bit of difference at that level. At a young level, yeah, I think it works. But at a undergrad and graduate level, I don't think that needs to be done. So 2-1-3 back row, 2-1-3 back again, 2-1-3 bass. Um, I have no, I've never seen anything like that. To be perfectly honest, um, that's weird. So seconds are on the outside, firsts are on the in the middle, thirds are on the right in three rows. So second, 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 first, 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 third, third, third. No, that doesn't make sense because your parts have to communicate with one another. That's not a. I, I don't see how that would be good for communication purposes. If you have three rows, firsts, seconds, thirds, boom, 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 one, two, three, and have the outside players be able to communicate with one another. But that doesn't make sense. I would never do that because essentially you've broken it. You now have three sections, so you have. Yeah, no, that doesn't make sense at all in my mind. I can't imagine communicating in the section like that. Was there any Oh, hi, Jared. I didn't put a notification on until like 20 minutes before I started, and I've been talking over 2 hours now. I'm going to leave this one up online and not take it down like I've done with the others because we've talked so much good stuff on this one. Um, but yeah, so recording interestingly. I, so well, it sounded fairly well from a recording. Interestingly, and yeah, I agree with you. Sensibly made rehearsing Schoenberg's theme and variations much more confusing than needed. Honestly. Okay, so you left out the recording aspect. So if you're recording it for a CD, that might be a little different. You do sometimes have to place ensembles a little bit differently when recording them. Um, it Even then, though, I just can't parse the idea of why you would do that. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, that it just makes it less sense then. You should keep all your streams up from now on. Occasionally I do. Sometimes I don't. I kind of like having the live streams just be kind of a little bit more intimate, really. Me and a bunch of band nerd friends, because I don't figure anybody's going to want to watch nearly 2.5 hours at this point of me talking, but who knows? It might. Part about the cylindrical double reed instruments. There is a modern Chinese double reed instrument called the Guanzi, the full berm system. I used to have the picture, but lost it. Now, okay, that's interesting. Um, uh, huh. Jared, send me a link to something like that on Facebook or Instagram, and I'll be interested in that. Um, Speaking of which, there's also the Mongolian single reed instrument and I cannot remember what it's called right now. Um, that is, uh, Jared, do you know what that is? There's a Mongolian clarinet type instrument that uses it's a much more modern instrument and uses standard key work. I'd have to look it up. I can't think of what it is right now. Yeah, the Ever Beret. Yes, that's it. That's a great name too. That would be something really interesting to look at incorporating into more Western style ensembles. It's a fascinating instrument. And you can find really very little about it. Um, but yeah, guys, go look up the instrument called the Ever Beret. It's Mongolian. And now I want Mongolian barbecue. Mm. Anyway, yeah. Um, and you don't see those pop up very often. I know. I wish I could find one too. That would be fantastic. It's one of those. I bet they could make them in different sizes so you could have a whole family of Ever Berets. And I may not be even pronouncing that right. That doesn't surprise me that there's one at the Musical Instrument Museum. I need to get back there one of these days. Next time I'm in Arizona. And I just love going to Arizona too. What foreign instruments would you want in the band? Well, there's one right there. The Ever Beret would be interesting. Taragato, I think, would be an interesting idea. So the problem with some of the foreign instruments. So I'm looking at like my DZs and my Bansuris across the room. Is that a lot of times they're not going to be tuned to Western scales. Um, Sorry about the little freeze just a second ago. I had a pop up notice on my phone there, and so we're good now. Um, I don't know. It would be difficult to start really incorporating some of those instruments. I think the percussion does a better job of that, of incorporating those type instruments. But with the wind instruments, it becomes more difficult. I could see, you know, I, you could make. I think they would need to be there for a purpose. So if you're doing a Japanese piece, I think you could easily bring in a shakuhachi. But uh, with a lot of these instruments, there is a connotation to them. There's a symbolism to them um, that goes hand in hand with the instrument itself. So if I were to score for a DZ in a piece, I would expect a Chinese connotation there. And it would be difficult to separate that from the cultural aspect. And it would. I don't know if I can answer that fully. That's. I don't know. I've thought about. I sketched out a piece years and years ago, where I tried using didgeridoos, um, in the piece. It was one of the long lost and abandoned symphonies that I did years and years ago, uh, before any of the ones that I actually claim now. I have like 7 unfinished symphonies, which is just uh, absurdly stupid. But anyway, yeah. Um, yeah, you just need to think about what the connotation of what you're writing is. If I were doing a South American piece, I might use a quenya or pan flutes. Who knows? All right. Any other questions? It is about 10 o'clock here. I have literally been talking for 2.5 hours straight. Um, I still have a little bit of coffee left, but it is ice cold, or as ice cold as you can get in August in Texas. But if there are no more questions, guys, I'm probably going to go ahead and wrap it up. I think a guitarone would be an interesting sound to add. The guitarone is just basically an acoustic bass guitar. I think the problem with the guitarone is it's not going to be loud enough to work well in a wind band. Um, it could. I mean, it could. Interesting. I bet you could use it alongside a double bass. And, thanks a bunch for this. I know I'm opinionated, but this is great fun. You know what? I think great artists need to be opinionated. If you are not opinionated about your art, I think you're doing something wrong. Um, I want to have strong opinions, um, in music and in art, because if I don't have strong opinions, it's not worth doing. So yeah, no, opinionated is great. Can we have a hot take stream? I don't know exactly what that is. Um, what about the accordion in the modern wind band? Yes, I think that could be absolutely fantastic. Um, I think the accordion is about to explode among composers. I know uh, David Bruce has talked a lot about it. I know Adam Neely has talked a lot about it. I think composers are going to start looking at accordion, and it's like, yeah, unpopular opinions. Okay, so here's my deal with unpopular opinions. And this is one thing that I argue with my girlfriend about. Probably the only thing is she loves watching these negative reaction videos on YouTube that talk about the worst of the worst. And I'm like, no, show me the best of the best. I want the good stuff. And you know what? I think the problem there is that the negative stuff gets more views. Like why I hate, and you know what? I will say this. My number one video is why do people hate the alto clarinet? It's got over 100,000 views. 100,000 people or more have listened to my whiny ass voice talk about the alto clarinet. Probably because I use the word hate in the title. Let that sink in. I don't fully understand it. So it's weird. I don't know if I'm of the opinion that I want to do something where I take down things. Thanks, Jared. I just got your link. Um, it might be interesting. It's going to take a lot to break accordion out of its stereotypes. It sounds so evocative of specific styles and eras. I don't think it's going to take that much. I don't, because I think that the process is already underway. Go to David Bruce's channel, and I think he's got a video on the accordion, and I think if you watch that, you'll be able to see, oh, okay, yeah, this is going to take off. And so I could easily see the hardest part would be getting players. You can find accordion players. If I needed an accordion player, I could get one pretty quickly. It's probably more difficult to find players for some of the auxiliary wind instruments that I love so much that it would be for. So, pretty popular instrument, the Lawrence Welk Show. One of my former bandmates in my local swing orchestra worked with that guy some. So he sat in with Lawrence Welk a few times. And exactly, yeah, Weird Al Yankovic. That man has done more for the accordion than anybody. Well, then I can cut you a deal on item number 202, Palmer Hughes Accordion Course Book number 1. I'm not going to be learning the accordion anytime soon. I've got enough instruments here right now. Jared, you don't need any more instruments. Oh, again, okay, well, you never know. YouTube, it's hard to tell a joke sometimes, particularly in the comment section. I don't know, have you ever read the comment section on YouTube? It's usually a cesspool of the worst of humanity. Hurdy-gurdy would be something cool to hear. Hurdy-gurdy is one of those weird instruments that is surprisingly more popular than I would have ever imagined. I don't doubt that, Tunarth. How much money could I buy a cheap working B-flat clarinet for? Jared, I'm going to let you answer that one. You are much more into the buying and selling of clarinets than I am. My clarinet was literally given to me. So I bought a saxophone and they said, here's a clarinet too. So, I mean, you could probably find one for about $100, honestly. Okay, yeah, any more questions? Maybe I'll think about a hot takes thing where I talk about the worst things. I saw a piece called for a dulcimer a while back and thought it was a great choice. What are your thoughts on the instrument used in bands? Dulcimer again is a more folk related instrument. In a wind band, it would be difficult to cut through. That said, the dulcimer's big brother, the cimbalom, has been used to great effect in a few pieces. There's Hari János by Zoltán Kodály. There's a couple pieces by Igor Stravinsky that call for it. And so that sound works in orchestral setting, and it work, of course, in a band setting. I just think with the typical like Appalachian mountain hammered dulcimer, I think they're just not going to be loud enough. They're not going to be able to produce enough sound for a wind band, unless you've got this really careful scoring. I mean, which is always possible if you pare it down to like one instrument, a dulcimer, it could work. You just need to know that that's the exact sound and exact texture you want. Did you ever hear the stuff with the viola organista? Is that the essentially bowed harpsichord? I think that's what it's called. Um, yeah. Um, Correct me if I'm wrong there, Common Pikachu. But I think that that's what you're talking about. And if that is the case, it's a lovely sound. I think that would be something fantastic to really experiment with. There's lots of yeah, okay, that's what I thought. There's lots of instruments like that that could be explored more. I was talking with a friend of mine the other day about some of these weird keyboard instruments. We're talking a lot about the instrument called a luthial, which is a piano with a mechanism built into it to make it sound like a cimbalom. And it's the instrument that Ravel used for his Tsigane, the violin solo piece. So that's not really for piano and violin, it's for violin and luthial. And there's like two working luthials in the world or something. And then there's the dulcitone, which is tuning forks. I guess they're all tuned, aren't they? But tuning forks chromatically, like a tuning fork celeste, which would be fascinating to use. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of those weird keyboard instruments. I particularly like using the harmonium. I've got a nice harmonium here. It's easy to work with, and it needs a lot of work on it. But you buy an organ for $50. Don't expect it to be perfect. All right, guys. Um, any other questions? This has been fun tonight. What about the melodica? Sure, I think the melodica, harmonica, and accordion all fit into this same category. That they absolutely could be used. I don't think you're going to see too much of a timbral difference between them. Back in graduate school, um, the orchestra at TCU did a tour, and we went down to Puerto Rico, and we took with us a harmonica soloist, and we played the Villa-Lobos harmonica concerto with a harmonica soloist, which was interesting, and it was interesting to see how the harmonica could really work well with the orchestral wind section. Uh, to Narth, I'm going to assume that's a quoting from some kind of pop music, and it's sorry, I don't do song lyrics. Okay, yeah. So with harmonica, melodic is exactly the same kind of tone color, just with a different mechanism. One of the great all-time pop melodica solos of the 1970s. Probably the only pop melodica solo of the 1970s, I'm guessing. Anyway, yeah, that is an unexplored area. It would be actually no. Who else was using melodica in the 1970s and why? 1970s were weird. I'm glad I didn't experience it. Miss it just that much, but I didn't need it. Okay, guys. Um, as many as were using harpsichords. Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Harpsichords were. Uh, I really want some new theremin pieces. Are you a theremin player? Um, I theremin would be one of those that would be absolutely fascinating to write for. Um, that said, I would prefer writing for the Ondes Martineau, but Ondes Martineau are so rare that you can't get a hold of one, so you're pretty limited to writing for theremin for that kind of sound. But the theremin is so much more difficult. Um, yeah, I would love one day to put a theremin or an Ondes Martineau piece part in one of my band pieces. Um, that would be so cool. theremin notation would look wild. Not really. Um, I mean, theremins just read off of regular sheet music. On Martineau, same thing. It's just a single staff. You don't have. You would notate it just like you would notate any string instrument, really. Um, I've got a copy of Messiaen's Trangalila over on my shelf, and the notation for it, the on Martineau, is simple, straight ahead. The only weird thing in there is, he gives you directions on what sound to use. It just reads treble clef. Well, it can read bass clef too if it goes down really low into the low range. But yeah, otherwise, yeah, it's just standard one clef. How do I spell what? Ondes Martineau? Ondes Martenot. Messiaen as a performer gives me a headache. I can't say that I've ever heard him perform. As a composer, absolutely brilliant. I love going back to Messiaen's works. And wrote some incredible pieces for wind band, too. There's two or three. Being the performer in his music. I have never performed any of Messiaen's music. It is very difficult to perform. That said, youth orchestras have tackled Turangalila. So there you go. Yes. I am a birder, so I'm kind of in that same vein as Messiaen. I love the bird call stuff. It is very, very difficult. And I've included bird calls in several of my pieces. I don't know Sept Haikai very. Tunar, that YouTube automatically blocked your comment because the word Dickens had the word dick in it. Oh, YouTube. Okay. So, all right, guys. It's getting late. I'm not getting sleepy because I had a whole one of these of espresso as we did this, but I am getting tired at least. I'll take a couple more questions if you have them, and then we'll schedule another one for next week, maybe next Wednesday again. And I'll think of a topic for next time. Maybe you guys could think of one and message me, and we'll have a topic to go on. And I think this was much more successful than last week's. Last week's didn't turn out too well. Otherwise, I think I am about done for the night. Oh yeah, I'll definitely have a listen to it. I've listened to most of his stuff, but I think that one's just kind of eluded me. All right, guys. So I am going to go ahead and call it an evening. Um, are there any advantages of the chimbasso over the trombone? They're different instruments. The chimbasso is a valved contrabass trombone, and think of it as that, the modern chimbasso anyway. And if you think about it like that, that's what it is. It should have the same kind of role and function as the contrabass trombone. Um, Otherwise, your regular trombones, your tenor and your bass trombones are going to have a much different range and function. But again, when Volume 3 is out, the very last chapter in here is all about the chimbasso. And of course, we got some ophicleide in here too. That's actually a rare contrabass ophicleide. So, anyway, guys, as I try and wrap it up again. Um, I will be on probably next Wednesday again. Maybe we can do one before then. Who knows? But these are fun, um, especially if we get a bunch of people interacting like it is. And well, I'm gonna go ahead and call it quits for tonight. Yeah, thanks guys. It's been fun, and I'll see you guys probably next week, next Wednesday. We'll schedule something. Night, guys. Love talking to you. This is fun. I love doing it. So we'll talk again.